In this part of the lecture, we will discuss access modifiers again, especially in the context of inheritance and polymorphism. So classes and their fields and methods have access labels, we understand it, to specify how they can be used by other objects during execution. Simply mean that how can we access the different fields and methods in our classes. So a private field or method is accessible only to the class in which it is defined. A protected field or method is accessible to the class itself, its subclasses, and classes in the same package. You need to remember that if you declare a field or a method as protected, it can be accessed, of course, within the class by the subclasses and the classes in the same package. A public field or method is accessible to any class of any parentage in any package. If you look at this table, if we declare a field or a method as private, it is accessible to the class itself. If we declare it as protected, of course it is accessible to the class. The public is accessible to the class, and the default is accessible to the class. A default would be if we do not use any access modifier with the field or the method. A private field or a method is not accessible to other subclasses within a package. A protected field or a method is accessible to the other subclasses within the package. A public one is of course accessible to other subclasses within the package, and a default method or field is accessible to the other subclasses within the package. A private one, again, other classes within a package is not accessible, and the rest of three are accessible. A protected one, a public one, and a default method or a field is accessible to the other classes within the package. We need to keep in mind that within the package, except for the private, all of the three would be accessible to the other classes. Other subclasses outside this package, private one is not accessible, a protected one is accessible, and a public one is accessible, but default method or field will not be accessible to other subclasses that are outside of the package in which the superclass is declared. Other classes outside the package, apart from the public method or fields, none of the other methods or fields would be accessible by the other classes that are outside of the package in which the class has been declared. The class that contains these fields or methods has been declared. So we can see that the default declaration and the protected declaration, that disagree on this one point only. Some people would say that a field or a method are protected by default, but that is not the case. In most of the cases they can be the same, but there is this difference that a protected field or a protected method would be accessible by the subclasses that are outside of the package in which the class has been declared, containing the class that contains the protected field or method, but the default field or method cannot be accessed by the subclasses that is declared from outside of the package from the class where the default method or the field has been declared. The public one would be of course accessible by the other classes as well as the subclasses from outside of the package. So we can see that there is this one difference between the protected and the default access. They are not exactly the same. Subclass within a package. So for example, we have class derived.java. We have protection class, and the protection class has a subclass derived, and they are in the same package p1. There is another class p2 derived from the protection class that is in a separate package p2, that is the other package. So the package p1 has public class protection, and it has a default variable and default, a public variable integer and public, a protected variable integer and protected, and a private int and private. And if you want to see which of these are accessible within the same package, so we have a public class derived that extends protection. So public class is derived is also is a subclass of the protection class. So if we try to access the end default, we should be able to access that, as we have seen that we are able to access the default fields from within the same package. Similarly, if we try to access the public variable, we can of course access the public variable. We would also be able to access the protected variable, but if we try to access the private variable from outside of the class protection, we cannot access the private variable from outside of the class protection. So these are within the same package. As we can see, we will compile all the files in the p1 package. The default one will give us an output, the public one will give us an output, the protected one will give us an output, but the access to the private variable will get us a compilation error. So we can say that other subclasses within a package cannot access the private variables, they can access the protected variables, they can access the public variables, and they can access variables that have default declaration. Other classes within a package. So we have the package p1 that has a derived class from the protection class, and if we try to access, let's say, the same variables, now the derived class was the subclass of the protection class. The same package class is not a subclass of the protection class, so there is a different kind of a relationship. They are within the same package p1, but there is no direct relationship between the protection class and the same package class. Now let's look at what can and cannot be accessed from the protection class by the same package class. We have a default access, we have a publicly declared variable, we have a variable that is declared as protected, and we have a variable that is declared as private. Now within the same package, of course, we can have an object of the protection class. We have been doing this without deriving from the class. We have been able to access or create an object for the class in another class within the same package. So we can access the default variable within the same package. We can access the protected variable within the same package, and we can access the protected variable within the same package, but again we won't be able to access the private variable within the same package by the other class. Now this class is not a subclass of the protection class, but the access modifiers behave similar to what we saw in our previous slide, that a private variable what is not accessible from the other class even within the same package. If that class is subclass of the superclass or has no relationship with the class, we will not be able to access the private variables. Similarly, protected one can be accessed from outside of the class, within the same package. Public one can be accessed from outside of the class within the same package, and the default variable can be accessed from outside of the class within the same package. Now let's look at how we can access from the subclasses that are outside of this package class. So how do we have the same package p1 that has a class protection, and we have another package p2 that has a class p2 derived. Now the p2 derived is a subclass of the protection class, although they are in different packages. So we have this class with the same credentials, and now we have the package p2 that has the class p derived that extends the p1.protection class. And of course we can declare an object of this class. If we try to access the default variable, now these are in different packages. We compile all the files within the packages. The default variable is not accessible by the subclass that is in another package. Although there is a direct relationship between the p2 derived class and the protection class, but since they are in two different packages, the default variables will not be accessible in the different package. And this was the difference between the protected variables and the default variables, that the protected variable are accessible by this class that is outside of the package class outside of the package p1, but is a subclass of the class that is in the package p1. We can access the public variable, of course, but we cannot access the private variable. Now access to the default variable. As we can see, no access to the private variable, but we can access the public and the protected variables. The private are not accessible, the protected were accessible, and the public were accessible. The default is not accessible. This is where the protected variables are different from the default variables. Now finally, we have two packages p1 and p2, and if we try to access the variables or the methods of the protection class that is declared in p1 from some class that is declared in p2, that is a different package, in this case the other package class, we may not be able to access the protected variables, the default variables, and of course the private variables. We can only access the publicly declared variables in the protection class. So there is no access to the default variable. As we can see, there is no access to the protected variable. As we can see, there is no access to the private variable, of course, as we can see. Other classes outside of this package, which is not a subclass of this protection class, we cannot access the private variables, of course. We cannot access the protected variables, which was we were able to access the protected variables when we had a subclass of the protection class in the different package, but we were not able to access the default variables, and we cannot access the default variables in this case as well. So this was our discussion of the access modifiers in the context of inheritance and polymorphism and packages that we discussed in this lecture. We will discuss abstract classes in the next lecture with an example that can contain some of the details from the lectures we have discussed over here. So see you in the next lecture.